Sergeant Alexander Hayes had seen many things in his years of service, but nothing quite like this. His ship had crashed on an alien planet, far from the safety of Earth. The landscape was a twisted blend of jagged mountains and broken, blackened land where the echoes of war were still fresh in the air. The crash had left him wounded and alone, with nothing but his gear and a barely functional radio. His mission had failed, and now survival was all that mattered. His eyes scanned the desolate horizon. There was no sign of the crew, no sign of hope. His best chance was to head toward the distant mountains, where he might find shelter or perhaps some other survivors. But the journey would be long, and the alien planet was dangerous. Still, there was no choice but to move forward. As he stumbled over the rough terrain, Alexander noticed something strange in the distance. It wasn't much, just a faint movement against the backdrop of the dead world. Curiosity, mixed with desperation, pulled him toward it. Slowly, he made his way toward the shape, moving cautiously to avoid drawing attention. It wasn't until he was much closer that he realized it was a small alien girl. She sat motionless, her back against a pile of debris, her eyes staring at the ground. Her skin was a soft shade of blue, smooth and almost luminous, and her hair, silver and long, fell in tangled strands over her shoulders. She was thin, fragile-looking and covered in dirt, her clothes torn from what appeared to be a recent struggle. The sight of her struck Alexander in a way he didn't expect, a pang of sympathy mixed with a sense of responsibility. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. The girl didn't seem to notice him approach, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. He cleared his throat, trying to get her attention. "Hey," he called softly. "Are you all right?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. She scrambled to her feet, her movements quick but erratic. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to understand who or what he was. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the wind howling through the wreckage of her village. "Human," she whispered, her voice small and trembling. She took a step forward, her hands reaching out slightly, as if drawn to him by some unseen force. "My mom. She's gone. Can I stay with you?" Alexander's heart skipped a beat at the words. The plea was so raw, so vulnerable. He had never seen a creature like her before, but the desperation in her voice was universal. In all his years in the military, he had never been in a situation like this. This wasn't a soldier asking for help. It was a child, lost and alone, in the middle of a war-torn planet. "Your mother?" Alexander asked, his voice softening. He kneeled down, trying to match her gaze. "Where is she? What happened to you?" The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the ruins of the village behind her. Her lips trembled before she spoke again. "The soldiers came. They took her. I couldn't stop them." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to fight back tears. "I'm alone now. Please. Can I stay with you?" Alexander's heart ached. He had always been a soldier, a protector of his own people. But this was something different. He was looking at a small, fragile being, one who had just lost everything, and somehow she was now asking him to take care of her. The idea of abandoning her felt wrong, but what could he offer her? He wasn't a father, he wasn't a guardian. He was just a soldier, a survivor of a crash, and his only goal was to stay alive. He glanced around, considering his options. The planet was hostile, and it was only a matter of time before more danger arrived. He had to keep moving if he wanted to survive, but could he really leave this girl behind? She looked so small, so helpless. The thought of leaving her to fend for herself filled him with guilt. No one, not even an alien, should have to survive on their own in a world like this. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. He extended his hand toward her. "I can't leave you here," he said, his voice steady. You can come with me. I'll help you. The girl's eyes lit up, and she stepped forward without hesitation, taking his hand. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet relief. Alexander nodded, though he felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He wasn't sure how he was going to protect her or what kind of dangers lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Together, they would face whatever the alien world threw at them. Lyra, the little alien girl, was quiet as they moved, her small steps almost too light to hear. Her eyes, wide and innocent, were fixed on the ground ahead, and her hands clutched the hem of Alexander's jacket tightly, as though afraid to let go. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice held a certain softness that stuck with him. "Where are we going?" she asked one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren land. Alexander paused for a moment, looking at the horizon. The mountains were still far off in the distance. He had hoped to reach them sooner, but the journey had been slow. The rough terrain and constant worry of danger made every step harder than the last. "We're heading toward the mountains," he said, keeping his tone steady. "It might be safer there. We'll find shelter. Maybe a way off this planet." Lyra nodded, though her eyes held a deep sadness. She wasn't asking for more than safety, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him feel like she needed something more. Something he wasn't sure he could give. "You're sad," she said softly, her voice catching him off guard. "Why are you sad?" He blinked, not sure how to answer. He had been trained to focus on the mission, not emotions. But now, with this little girl relying on him, everything seemed different. "I'm not sad," he replied, though the words felt hollow. "I'm just worried about getting to safety. There's a lot of danger out here." Lyra looked up at him, her alien eyes searching his face. "But you're strong, right? My mom always said that humans are strong." The word stung more than he expected. Lyra's mother, the woman she had lost, had clearly been someone important, someone who had cared for her deeply. Alexander thought about his own mother, how long it had been since he had seen her, and a strange pang of guilt rose in his chest. He wasn't her mother, and he wasn't even sure he could protect her properly. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was starting to settle in. He wasn't just protecting her from the dangers of this planet. He was protecting her from a universe that didn't seem to care. And no matter how strong he was, that was a heavy burden. As the days went on, Lyra started to show signs of adjustment. She was no longer as quiet as before, asking him questions about Earth and the stars. She seemed fascinated by the idea of Earth, her small fingers tracing the shape of a star map that Alexander had in his pack. "Do you miss it?" she asked one night, as they sat beside a fire made from dry brush. "Earth, I mean." Alexander looked into the fire, his mind drifting back to the home he had left behind, to the life that had been interrupted. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I miss the people I knew. I miss the sky, the trees, the way things felt peaceful." Lyra nodded as if she understood. "I miss my mom. She used to tell me stories about the stars. She said that when I was old enough I'd understand them. But now, she's gone." There was a long pause before Alexander spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I'm sorry about your mom, Lyra. I know how it feels to lose someone." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I think you understand more than you want to," she said quietly. It was true. He understood more than he cared to admit. The loss, the empty feeling, it was something he knew all too well. But the weight of it all was heavier with Lyra around. He couldn't let his emotions show. Not now. She needed him to be strong. She needed him to lead the way. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when she wasn't looking, Alexander allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. The strange loneliness of being stuck on an alien planet, the fear of being unable to protect her, the worry that he wasn't enough. He had always thought of himself as strong, but now he realized that strength wasn't just about muscles or weapons. It was about responsibility. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And that was something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The next day, they continued on their journey. The mountains loomed closer, but the path was still treacherous. The wind kicked up sand and dust, making it harder to see. Alexander kept a tight grip on his weapon, eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. He was still on high alert. Lyra, for her part, was quieter that day, almost as if the weight of their journey had finally started to sink in. She walked beside him, her eyes fixed on the ground. She wasn't asking for reassurance anymore, and that made Alexander uneasy. "Are you okay?" he asked her, his voice cutting through the silence. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm okay," she replied softly, her voice steady. "But I'm scared. What if we don't make it?" The question hit him like a punch. What if they didn't make it? What if all their effort was for nothing? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at her, meeting her gaze with a fierce determination. "We'll make it," he said, firmly. "I'll make sure of it." And for the first time since they started this journey, Alexander believed his own W, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to be afraid of the dark," she said, her words almost lost in the wind. "But now I'm afraid of the light. It hurts." Her gaze shifted, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. "The sun is too bright here. It burns." Alexander felt a pang of sympathy for her. She wasn't just a little girl who had lost her mother. She was an alien, stranded on a planet far from home, with no idea what would come next. He knew what it felt like to be a stranger in a strange land. But that didn't make it any easier to watch someone so small, so fragile, suffer in a way he couldn't fix. "I get it," he said softly. "The sun's brutal here, but we'll find a place where you'll be safe. I promise." Lyra nodded, though she didn't look reassured. She was trying to believe him, trying to trust him, but the weight of the unknown was still heavy in her heart. It was the same for Alexander. They were both running from something, but what they were running toward remained a mystery. The next day, as they continued their trek through the desert, they were forced to take shelter in a narrow canyon when the wind picked up even more fiercely. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Alexander found a rock overhang, just big enough for them to squeeze under, and they huddled there, waiting for the storm to pass. It was during this time, as they sat in silence, that Alexander heard something he hadn't expected, a low growl just beyond the reach of their shelter. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable growl of a predator, a creature that hunted in the harshest parts of the planet. His hand immediately went to his weapon, but Lyra grabbed his arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "It's coming," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's not just one." Alexander's grip tightened on his weapon as the growl grew louder, closer. He could hear the scraping of claws on the rocky ground, the sound of something large moving in the dust. His mind raced as he thought about their options. They were trapped in a canyon, with no way out but the narrow opening, and no time to make it to the mountains before the creature arrived. He glanced down at Lyra, who was staring at the entrance of their shelter, her eyes wide but calm. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself, and the thought of facing this predator alone made Alexander's blood run cold. He would protect her, no matter the cost. "We have to stay quiet," he whispered, leaning closer to her. "Don't move unless I tell you. Understand?" Lyra nodded without a word, her expression focused. Alexander could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment settling around them. The growl was louder now, almost at their shelter's entrance. He tightened his grip on his weapon, ready for whatever came through that gap. Then, in a sudden flash of movement, something huge lunged toward the opening. Alexander didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, and the creature let out a roar of pain. But the shot hadn't been enough. The creature, whatever it was still coming. Before he could take another shot, Lyra stepped forward. Her eyes were glowing faintly, her small body trembling with the effort, but she held her hand out toward the creature. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a sudden burst of energy, a force rippled through the air, throwing the creature back. Alexander's eyes widened in shock. He had never seen anything like it. The creature was thrown several feet away, its massive body crashing into the rocky walls of the canyon with a sickening thud. It didn't move again. Lyra collapsed to her knees, exhausted. Alexander rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "You did it," he said, kneeling beside her. "How did you—" Lyra shook her head, too weak to answer. "I don't know," she whispered. It's like my mother was inside me, helping me." Alexander didn't know what to say. He helped her to her feet, his thoughts racing. Lyra's abilities were growing stronger, but they were also unpredictable. She was more than just a lost child. She was something else entirely. And whatever she was, it was clear that the galaxy would never leave them alone. The narrow canyon had offered them a brief reprieve from the dangers of the desert, but the quiet that followed the creature's retreat didn't last long. Alexander stood guard, his eyes scanning the shadows where the creature had vanished. His hands were still trembling from the shock of the fight, but he forced himself to remain focused. Lyra, on the other hand, was slumped against the rocks, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her small frame trembled, her exhaustion evident. "That was—" Alexander began, but the words felt inadequate. He didn't know what to call it. Whatever had happened, it was beyond his understanding. Lyra had saved them, but at what cost? He knelt beside her, gently lifting her chin so she would meet his eyes. "Are you all right?" Lyra nodded slowly, though her gaze remained distant. "I don't feel like myself," she murmured. "I've never done something like that before." She paused, a deep frown crossing her face. "I don't understand why it happened." Alexander wanted to reassure her, but he didn't have the answers. He knew she was struggling to make sense of her newfound power, just as he was. But one thing was certain. Lyra was capable of more than he had imagined. Her strength had saved them, but it had also raised new questions. What else could she do? And how far could her abilities stretch before they became uncontrollable? "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "We need to rest for now. The storm's died down, but the road ahead won't be easy." Lyra said nothing, but she nodded in agreement, her exhaustion overtaking her. Alexander helped her to her feet, supporting her as they moved out of the canyon and back into the open desert. They continued their journey toward the mountains, though the path was now fraught with uncertainty. The Predator's attack had been a stark reminder of the dangers lurking on this planet, but Lyra's power had introduced an entirely new set of problems. She wasn't just a helpless child anymore. She was something else, something that could change everything. As the days passed, their journey grew more difficult. The terrain became even more treacherous, the sun relentless in its heat. Alexander kept his eyes fixed on the mountains ahead, hoping to reach some form of shelter soon. But no matter how far they traveled, the dangers never seemed to fade. The hostile creatures of the planet grew more aggressive, and each day brought new challenges. Yet, despite it all, Lyra remained by his side. Her silence had deepened, but she never wavered in her commitment to follow him. One afternoon, as they Reached the base of the mountains, the ground began to tremble beneath their feet. Alexander froze, his senses alert. He turned to Lyra, who was looking around, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you feel that?" he asked. Lyra nodded, her face pale. It's coming," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The ground continued to shake, and the air grew heavy with tension. The sound of rocks falling echoed through the mountain pass, and Alexander knew that something large was approaching. A low growl reached their ears, and a chill ran down Alexander's spine. He immediately dropped to one knee, preparing his weapon. He glanced at Lyra, whose face had gone pale, and for the first time he saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "I can't fight it," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "It's too strong." Alexander knew she was right. Whatever was coming was far beyond their ability to handle, even with her powers. They were running out of options. He quickly scanned their surroundings, trying to find a way to escape, but the narrow mountain pass offered little cover. Their only chance was to outrun whatever was coming, but with the terrain so treacherous, that seemed unlikely. "We have to move now!" he shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her toward the rocks ahead. He knew they didn't have much time. The ground continued to shake, and the growls grew louder, closer. They were being hunted, and the odds weren't in their favor. As they moved toward a narrow crevice in the mountain, a massive shadow loomed overhead, blocking out the sun. Alexander barely had time to react before the creature struck, its enormous claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. Lyra screamed, and Alexander instinctively threw himself in front of her, taking the brunt of the blow. His body collided with the ground, pain radiating through his chest. For a moment, everything went black. When Alexander regained consciousness, he was lying on the ground, his body bruised and battered. The creature was gone, but the silence that followed was deafening. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he pushed through the pain, forcing himself to sit up. "Lyra," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's face appeared in his vision, her small hands gently resting on his shoulders. Her eyes were wide with concern, and for the first time in days, she looked truly afraid. "You're hurt," she said softly. "You need to rest." Alexander shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his body disagreed. "We have to keep moving. We need to get to the mountains." Lyra looked at him with a mix of determination and fear. "You're not fine. You can't keep going like this." Her voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable strength in it. "I'll help you. I can help." Alexander met her gaze, seeing the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't just a helpless child. She had power that could change everything. But was it enough to keep them both alive? "I'm not sure how much longer we can survive this," he admitted, his voice heavy. "But I'll get us to safety. I swear it." And for the first time since the crash, Alexander allowed himself to believe in something other than survival. They would make it. Together, they would make it. The pain in Alexander's chest throbbed with every breath, but he ignored it. There was no time to stop, no time to rest. They couldn't afford to slow down, not now, not when they were so close to the mountains. Despite his injuries, he pushed forward, one step at a time. Lyra walked beside him, her small hand gripping his arm tightly, offering the only support he had left. "We'll be safe soon," he added, trying to lift her spirits. But his words felt hollow, even to him. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. As they reached the base of the mountain, the landscape began to change. The air grew cooler, and the dry, barren earth turned into rocky terrain that was harder to navigate. The path grew steeper, the rocks jagged and uneven. Alexander gritted his teeth against the pain, his legs burning with every step, but he kept going. pushing forward because there was no other choice. Lyra, noticing his struggle, stepped closer, her small hand gently brushing against his. "You're hurt," she said softly. "You should rest. Let me carry you." Alexander shook his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We don't have time for that. We have to keep moving." Lyra didn't argue. She simply kept walking beside him, her pace matching his, as if to ensure he wasn't alone in the struggle. Despite her small size, her presence felt like a strength he could rely on. The weight of his exhaustion seemed a little lighter when she was near. The climb became more treacherous as they ascended higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, and Alexander's breath came harder. The pain in his chest worsened, but he refused to let it slow him down. They had to reach the top where they could find shelter. It was their only hope. But as they neared the summit, the ground beneath them began to shake again, just as it had before. The tremors were subtle at first, but they quickly grew stronger, rattling the rocks around them. Alexander's heart raced as he looked to Lyra, whose face was filled with fear. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumbling noise. "It's coming!" Alexander gripped his weapon tightly, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the creature. The growls echoed through the mountains, low and menacing. They were being hunted again, and this time there was no easy way to escape. The creature had found them. They had nowhere to run. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form filling the narrow pass. It was a beast unlike anything Alexander had ever seen. Its scales gleamed in the dim light, its claws long and sharp, its eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It moved with terrifying speed, its growls sending vibrations through the air. Alexander knew that this time they couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide. They had to fight. He turned to Lyra, who was standing frozen, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in her eyes, too. Something that had changed since their first encounter with danger. She wasn't just scared, she was determined. "I'm going to protect you," Alexander said, his voice steady though his heart was racing. "Stay behind me." But Lyra didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward, her small hand reaching out toward the creature. For a moment, Alexander thought she was going to run. But then he saw the glow in her eyes. The same glow from the first time she used her power. "No," Lyra whispered, almost to herself. "I won't let it hurt you." She held her hand out, and a wave of energy rippled through the air. It wasn't like anything Alexander had seen before. There was a raw power in it, a force that seemed to come from deep within her. The creature roared, rearing back as if it had been struck by an invisible blow. But Lyra didn't stop. She focused, her entire body trembling with effort, and the energy around her grew stronger, more intense. The creature howled in pain, its massive body crashing against the rocks as Lyra's power forced it back. Alexander could only watch in awe as Lyra's abilities overwhelmed the beast. Her eyes glowed brightly now, her small form standing strong in the face of danger. Finally, with a final deafening roar, the creature collapsed, its body lifeless. On the rocky ground, Lyra fell to her knees, exhausted, her eyes dimming as the glow faded. Alexander rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lyra, are you all right?" She nodded weakly, her breath shallow. I'm okay," she whispered, though the effort of using her power had clearly drained her. Alexander helped her to her feet, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Lyra had defeated the creature, something he would have never thought possible. Her powers were growing stronger, but so was the danger. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find shelter at the top. We're almost there." Lyra nodded, leaning on him for support. Together, they continued their climb, knowing that they weren't just fighting for their survival. They were fighting for each other. The night sky was clear as they finally reached the summit of the mountain, the peaks towering high above the alien world. The air was cooler here, and Alexander felt a small sense of relief as they made their way into a shallow cave they had discovered near the top. The threat of the creature was finally behind them, for now. But Alexander knew that they couldn't relax just yet. There was still much ahead of them. Lyra was quiet as they settled into the cave, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the stars above. Alexander didn't want to acknowledge how badly he was hurting, but the pain in his chest was unbearable. He was exhausted from the journey, his body aching in ways he couldn't ignore anymore. Still, he pushed it aside, focused on Lyra. She needed him now, and he couldn't afford to show any weakness. "We made it," Alexander said, his voice tired but reassuring. "We're safe for now." Lyra nodded slowly, though her gaze remained distant. She had been unusually quiet ever since the battle with the creature, and Alexander couldn't help but wonder if it was the toll of using her powers. He had seen the strain in her face, the way she had collapsed afterward. Using that kind of power wasn't easy, especially for someone so young. He wasn't sure how much more of it she could take. "I'm not scared anymore," Lyra said after a long pause. Her voice was soft, but there was a strength in it that made Alexander look up. "I used to be afraid of everything, the dark, the unknown, losing my mom. But now I know what I can do." Alexander watched her carefully. He had seen her grow, seen her become stronger with every challenge they faced. But what was she really capable of? How much power did she have, and was it safe to let her use it? The questions weighed on his mind, but he didn't voice them. Lyra was still a child, and he didn't want to burden her with the fear that he was feeling. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, surprising himself with the sincerity in his words. "You've been through more than most people would ever have to face, and you're still standing." Lyra smiled faintly, though the sadness in her eyes never fully disappeared. "I don't feel like I'm standing," she admitted, her voice small again. "I feel like I'm just waiting for something to change, for something to make all this pain go away." Alexander didn't know what to say. He didn't have any answers for her. He had spent so much of his life following orders, sticking to plans, and thinking that he knew what the future would hold. But now, everything was uncertain. He wasn't just responsible for himself anymore. He had someone else to protect. And that made the future seem both more important and more fragile than ever. Lyra curled up against the rocks, her eyes drifting closed. Alexander, still wide awake, stared at the stars above, his mind swirling with thoughts. He thought about his mission, his crew, Earth, and everything that had been lost since the crash. He thought about the dangers that still lurked on this planet, the unknowns that waited for them. But most of all, he thought about Lyra. She had come into his life, out of nowhere, and now he couldn't imagine life without her. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let her be alone in this world. The wind howled outside the cave, but inside, it was quiet. Peaceful for the moment. Alexander closed his eyes, allowing himself to rest, though his thoughts never fully slowed. He was on high alert, as always, ready for anything. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not when Lyra needed him. Hours passed, and the world outside remained still. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke across the sky that Alexander finally let himself fall into a light sleep. But his rest was short. A sharp noise echoed through the cave, waking him instantly. His hand flew to the weapon at his side, his senses on high alert. Lyra stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I don't know," Alexander replied, his voice low. He stood, motioning for her to stay down. He moved carefully toward the entrance of the cave, his eyes scanning the rocky terrain for any sign of danger. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a shape moved in the distance, something large and dark against the horizon. It was hard to make out in the dim morning light, but Alexander's instincts screamed at him that it was dangerous. His hand tightened around his weapon. The last thing he needed right now was another fight, but they didn't have much choice. They had to defend themselves. "Lyra," he whispered urgently. "Get ready. We're not alone." Lyra nodded, her face pale but resolute. She stood, her body trembling, as she faced whatever was coming. Alexander could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else. Something fierce. Something that reminded him that she wasn't just a child. She was a force, a power that had already saved them once before. The shape in the distance grew closer, and Alexander could make out the features of the creature, a massive, four-legged beast with glowing red eyes, its body covered in thick, spiked armor. It moved with terrifying speed, and Alexander knew they didn't have much time. The creature was fast, and it was headed straight for them. "Stay close," he ordered, positioning himself between Lyra and the beast. He raised his weapon, aiming, carefully. But before he could fire, Lyra stepped forward, her eyes glowing with that familiar light. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'll handle this." Alexander reached for her arm, but it was too late. Lyra had already raised her hand, and a powerful wave of energy shot toward the creature, knocking it back several feet. The beast howled in pain, but it wasn't defeated. It charged again, faster this time. Lyra's power surged again, but this time Alexander could see the strain on her face. She was pushing herself too hard. Her body trembled with the effort, but she didn't stop. The creature faltered, its movements slowing. But then, without warning, it lunged one last time. "Lyra, move!" Alexander shouted, but the beast was too fast. Lyra didn't move, her eyes locked onto the creature. With a final surge of energy, she sent the beast crashing to the ground, its body lifeless. Lyra collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. I did it," she whispered, her voice weak. Alexander rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "You did," he said, his voice filled with both pride and fear. "But you need to rest. You've pushed yourself too far." He approached her slowly, his voice soft. "How are you feeling?" Lyra looked up at him, her expression tired but steady. "I'm okay," she replied, though he could tell she wasn't telling the whole truth. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue, and she wasn't sitting up as straight as usual. "I just need to rest." Alexander didn't press her further. She had been through too much, and he didn't want to push her. Instead, he turned his attention to their immediate surroundings. The mountains had given them some shelter, but they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to keep moving, find something more permanent. If they wanted to survive, they needed to plan ahead. He glanced at Lyra again. "We should head toward the valley. There's a settlement there, a place where humans might be. If we can reach it, we might find help." Lyra nodded slowly, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. She had been so quiet lately, and it worried Alexander. He knew that the journey had taken its toll on both of them, but he couldn't afford to let her see his own doubts, not when they were so close. They couldn't stop now, not after everything they'd been through. The valley wasn't far, but the path was treacherous. The rocks grew more unstable as they descended, and the ground became softer, more unpredictable. They were still deep in alien territory, surrounded by dangers that neither of them fully understood. And with every step, Alexander couldn't shake the thought that the worst might not be over. Lyra stayed close by his side as they moved, her small hand clutching his jacket for support. She didn't speak, but the way she leaned into him told him all he needed to know. She trusted him. In return, He would do everything in his power to keep her safe. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. They stopped briefly to rest. In a small hollow, the shade of the rocks offering them some relief from the oppressive heat. Alexander sat down, rubbing his eyes in exhaustion. It had been days since they had last rested properly. They needed food, water, and some time to regain their strength. But every time he let himself relax, the reality of their situation crept back into his mind. They were still on a hostile planet, and danger could strike at any moment. Lyra, sensing his unease, broke the silence. "What happens when we find the settlement?" she asked softly. Alexander glanced at her, his thoughts momentarily interrupted. "We'll get help," he said. "We'll find a way to get back to Earth, but for now we have to keep moving. We can't afford to stop for too long." Lyra didn't argue, but the way she looked at him made him feel like she was carrying more than just her physical fatigue. She was holding on to something deeper, something that he didn't quite understand. It was like a part of her was already lost, a piece of her that no one, not even him, could heal. "I'm scared," she admitted after a long pause. Her voice, barely above a whisper. Alexander felt his heart tighten. He had known it was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made the weight of the situation even more real. He had tried to shield her from the worst of it, but he couldn't protect her from everything. He could only do his best. "I know," he said quietly, reaching over to place a hand on hers. "But we'll make it through. We have each other, and that's enough." Lyra didn't say anything, but she squeezed his hand in return. She was still scared, still lost in the unknown, but for the first time in days, she seemed to draw some comfort from his words. Maybe it was enough. For now. As they continued down the mountain, the valley grew closer. The terrain shifted again, becoming smoother, and the landscape began to show signs of life. Alexander could feel a slight shift in the air. Hope, maybe. They were almost there, but as they neared the edge of the valley, something caught his eye. A figure. It was standing in the distance, half hidden by the rocks, and its silhouette was unmistakable. It wasn't a human. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her behind him. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. "Don't move." They crouched low, the figure moving cautiously toward them. Alexander's grip tightened on his weapon, his pulse racing. It was an alien. But which kind? And what did it want? The figure drew closer, and Alexander realized it wasn't alone. There were more, shadows gathering around the first. He could see their forms now, tall, armed, and clearly not friendly. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get Lyra to safety, but they were surrounded, and there was nowhere to go. Not unless they wanted to face whatever these creatures were in open ground. "I don't want to fight," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to Lyra. "But I will if I have to." Lyra didn't answer, but she held on to him tightly, her small body trembling against his. They were about to face another challenge, and this time they weren't sure they would make it out alive.